Thank you all for joining again. Nothing for us without us, troubling affinity spaces in times of catastrophe. This workshop invites us all into work grounded in spirit, and it will detail how we can fashion interventions responsive to the profound effects of injustice, violence, and exploitation on our psychological, communal, and ecological well-being. So with that being said, it's time to introduce our speakers. Can we go to the next slide, please? I think, okay, awesome. Sometimes we get a little frozen. So we are proud to have Farah Tanis from the Black Women's Blueprint, who you can tweet, follow, and tag. Claudia will be adding her handle in the chat. And Farah is a transnational Black feminist, human rights activist, and co-founder, executive director of Black Women's Blueprint. And fortunately, we have Savannah Brown as well, who is the associate director at the Black Women's Blueprint. Could we go to the next slide, please? Thank you. She is also a birth worker through Ancient Song Doula Services and the Doula Project. So I could say so much more about these two, but I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to them to share their bold moves to end sexual violence. So we'll have a second here to switch screens and give folks time to pin the ASL interpreter again.
Let me know if we're ready.
We're ready to go, yeah.
We're ready to go. Greetings, family. Greetings again. For those of you who were here yesterday at the plenary, it is amazing, amazing to be in space with you again. I thank you so much for introducing me, siblings and family at CASA. It's wonderful to be here with my amazing colleague and sister, Savannah Brown. And for the purpose of this workshop, I want to reintroduce myself. I want to reintroduce myself in terms of who I am, who my people are, right? We all have done who our people are at some point. I hope you have had the opportunity to connect with people on that level and connect with others on that level. And you'll see why it's so important to ground ourselves and to talk about who our people are. What do we come to the table with? Who are we? So who am I? Who are my people? What do I come to the table with? My name is Farah. In Arabic language, it means happy and happiness, right? My people are the descendants of people from West Africa and from the Middle East and from colonizers who came from France and Spain and Brazil. I'm sorry, not Brazil, and Portugal. My people are resilient. My people fought a revolution to free a nation. My people are the people from Haiti on the island of Hispaniola. I say Haiti. Some of you may know it as Haiti, right? The first freed nation. We fought for our revolution. My people are spicy food eaters. My people are people who learn to beat the drums at age 5. My people are fighters. My people are dancers. My people speak. My people laugh. My people pray. My people believe in spirituality. My people move nations and move energy around them. They conjure. They help birth babies. They help heal people. My people are magical, spiritual. They are phenomenal beings. And my people are in constant conversation and in constant contact with their ancestors. And so I bring all of this to the table. I bring all of the art and the love and the dance and the movement and the swaying and the rituals to this table to connect with you. And so this is who I am, and this is what I bring to the table, and this is who my people are. I'm going to pass it to Savannah.
Hey, we can see you, Farah, and thank you for invoking your people, your lands, your food, your traditions, the sounds that your people make, the smells, right? The rituals, the prayers. And so I'll share just a little bit as well. You know, we can read each other's bios and all of those kinds of things, but a deepening and a connection is what we're calling for today. So I'll just share a little bit about who my people are. I am certainly the daughter, granddaughter of lion-hearted women, fierce feminist women. I am the granddaughter of Black granny midwives. My grandmother in particular was a nurse midwife from the rural South Hazelhurst, Mississippi in the US. I am a birth keeper of women, of people. I am a little sister. I am a little cousin. I am the daughter of Black Pentecostal churches and also of women who understand and know their healing magic, as you talked about, Farah. I am home where speaking tongues is a regular occurrence and tradition. I am a part of a legacy of women across the water and women who work to make water flow and who build wells and who continue to feed nations. I am the daughter of the South. I am the daughter of the African diaspora, of feet stomping, hand clapping, worshiping, prayerful warriors. And I'm a mama to an outrageous, energetic, creative, innovative 2-year-old named Panther, and a partner and a lover and a laugher, and someone who knows that this work runs through my blood as a justice seeker and as a freedom fighter and as someone who seeks to be on the right side of our liberation. And so those are who my people are: collard greens, mac and cheese, fried chicken, all of it. And jazz and gospel and everything in between. So really excited to be in your presence today and to learn more about who you are and why you come to this work and how you arrive at this work beyond your title. And more so, you know, what allowed you to be the person that you are in this work. So welcome and excited to connect even more.
Excellent, excellent. So we're going to get started. I'm going to tell you about Black Women's Blueprint. Now, many of you already know about Black Women's Blueprint, but we'll just do a quick review so that we can jump right in to the meat of this conversation today. So Black Women's Blueprint, we're a Black feminist organization. We use civil and human rights approaches to organize and develop a culture where women, girls, gender nonconforming and gender fluid people are fully empowered and where disparities are erased. Our major initiatives have focused historically on sexual violence prevention, national healing initiatives, advocacy and organizing, the Black Women's Truth and Reconciliation Commission, also engaging men. We've focused on engaging men at the city level ratification of the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination against Women or all forms of gender discrimination. We administer culturally relevant information and resources and trainings. We facilitate collaboration, and that is who we are. Our vision has been to create a world where individuals, communities, and all beings are restored to their most balanced, especially now. It's so incredibly important, so incredibly relevant, even today, right? And 10 years old. Our vision is to restore ourselves and restore each other to our whole, full selves, moving the world from one of mourning to one where there is joy, from one of sadness to one where we can fully live and step into how happy we were meant to be, and legacies of freedom, one where all lives, all bodies, all lands are honored and communities find a home for their various spiritualities and prayers, meditations, and practices. And so really at this moment, as we just finished our strategic plan, our work really now sits across two pillars. It stands at two pillars: restorative justice and reproductive justice. which we'll talk about at some other point.
And so we wanted to also share, as we begin to engage in what I hope will be a really interactive space, what is the collective practice, right? The principles. In Calcasa, you've already shared, agreements that will work under, right, in this shared and communal space together. But we've adopted these principles from NTANYA Lee, who's an incredible cross-sectoral activist and advocate that really following.
Let's go to the next slide, the collective practice slide.
And those practices really lift up ways that we can be together, right? Ways that we can engage together. And so the first is to understand the notion that we are living beings creating living work, right? And so to know that not just this workshop, but all of the work we do together is an invitation to bring solutions and suggestions. That as we do this work together, as we workshop, as we move forward, that we also assume good intent and attend to impact, right? There might be intent and then there might be impact. They may be different from one another. So how do we attend to impact with one another? That will also engage in tension, right? We will not move far away from it and we won't engage in drama instead, but instead we'll be together collectively in a principle of struggle and tension. That we are creating a new world, right? While at the same time, we're immersed in this realm of intersecting oppressions. So we know that we do not yet have the world we're creating, but we are engaging in creating it. In the next slide. It's also critical that we struggle for the sake of deepening unity, right? And also deepening our collective understanding of one another, collective understanding of our movement work, collective understanding of the world that we're in. And then, of course, confidentiality, right? So preserve how sacred this space is, how sacred this virtual room, incubator, cocoon is. Cite work as you encounter it, cite work as it reveals itself to you, cite revelations, and even personal narratives or stories or engagements that show up in the chat, right? We each get to sit with ourselves and embody the work today. And so confidentiality is so crucial and so critical as we deepen and as we stretch ourselves. So we thank NTANYA Lee for these amazing principles and liberatory principles. And if there are more that people want to add, drop them in the chat and engage with us and let us know what will make you feel most expansive here with us today. And then the next slide, let's not relegate the issues, right? Particularly the issues that are hard to confront, issues that are hard to navigate or deal with, or that are not mainstreamed. Let's not relegate them to culturally specific or even diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? Like, let's not marginalize ourselves, our work, our intentions any further, but instead let's allow them to be central and centered here, just as we allow ourselves to be centered and central. To the next slide, Farah will ground us.
Thank you, Savannah. Thank you. Now, okay, so we took off running really at the beginning there, right? And just as we are really looking to ground ourselves, I want to invite you just to take a moment, right? And I know we've been doing this throughout this time at NSAC, right? At the plenary, at the different workshops, where people are inviting us and we've been inviting each other to breathe. And I want to thank a Sacred Space, Spiritual Alchemy, ML Daniels, my MEV folks, and Feng Tao for this particular grounding practice that we are about to engage in. And you can engage in this on your own. And Savannah and I usually do this facing each other. If you're in a room with someone, do face each other to say this to each other. If you are by yourself, think of doing this for yourself and think of your movement, think of the people who surround you on a daily basis. But I do thank them. I wanted to make sure to really send a shout out to Spiritual Alchemy, Sacred Space, and thank thou, ML Daniel, for this particular practice. And so it goes like this. And please, if you can, repeat this after me or in your heart as you take very deep breaths and sort of just settle yourself, really settle yourself in your chair, if you are home, on your couch, if you're in your kitchen, just settle yourself so that we can engage in this transformative work that we're about to engage in. And this particular exercise, this particular grounding practice, and this speaking in this manifestation is called I am because you are. And so as I say one sentence, you please, if you can, speak it with me or right after me. So Savannah and I will practice this and we will take you through it. I will begin. Savannah Brown, I am you and you are me.
I am you and you are me.
When you are free, I am free.
When you are free, I am free.
When you win, I win.
When you win, I win.
When you are loved, I am loved.
When you are loved, I am loved. Sarah, I am you and you are me.
I am you and you are me.
When you are free, I am free.
When you are free, I am free.
When you win, I win.
When you win, I win.
When you are loved, I am loved.
When you are loved, I am loved. Ashe. Ashe, Ashe. So with that, I want to move forward into some of this very difficult sort of conversation that we're about to have about troubling affinity spaces. This is not to say that there is anything wrong with affinity spaces. In fact, there are places where they belong. There are places where we appreciate them. We know how critical they can be, right? Especially for oppressed people or for people seeking solutions for how to engage in liberation work. So let's talk about the learning objectives. What are the learning objectives for this? Really, it's very basic for us, right? This workshop will detail how a commitment to co-creating vibrant communities while surfacing indigenous understandings of human connection can save us all. And when we say indigenous understandings, right, we mean indigeneity, which stems from, which is rooted in the place where you come from, the place where your people come from. And so when I talked about my people, right, I'm talking about that indigeneity. When I step into Benin, when I step into the continent, I'm talking about that indigeneity. If you are here in what is now called the United States, we honor the indigenous people and the indigenous understandings of the people here. If you are from any place in Europe, and if you are not in touch with where that is that you are from, get in touch with that. What is your indigenous understanding before this time, before this place, before this level of oppression, before this mess that has been created, right? Mm-hmm. So we're going to engage and step into that and step into possibility, not just possibility that depends on creating a new future, but possibility that knows that before this, there was a time when we were at peace, right? And so we'll detail what's our commitment to that. What does it mean to live and bring forth a future that really comes from a place of goodness, a place of authenticity, a place of authentic relating when we still knew how to do it, a place of beloved community, a place of really change, right? A place of just interconnectedness. And so we're going to cover some of these theories. Everything we're talking about is going to be really rooted in these practical frameworks of authentic relating, beloved community, developmental change, communities of change process, integral development, really feminist transformation, right? As we understand it, womanist transformation as we understand it, right? And of course, racial healing. Okay. Slide, right? So what are affinity spaces, right? What is an affinity space to you? Right? Like I really like for this, we'd really like for this to be a reflective process, right? In this moment right here, we want to ask you what affinity spaces have been to you. You can put it in the chat, right? So we can just go ahead and list it. I know we can't see each other or as much and can't speak to each other, but put it in the chat for sure.
What is an affinity space to you, and what have you seen in affinity space?
Mm-hmm.
We
I see
determine
online forums, right? A place to feel safe. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Women's spaces and Africana women's spaces, sharing experiences. Yes, webinars like this. That's right.
A space for supporting each other, a place to listen.
Trans Latinx spaces. Yes.
Space.
Yes. Yes. Ooh, it's going fast. It's going fast.
A place to feel seen, right? Being in community, who you share your identity or your history with. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Purpose, work. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
A place for learning new things. Yes.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's right.
Seen, heard, and understood. A place of support. Shared experiences, identity, culture.
Mm-hmm.
I don't have to explain who you are. Yes.
That's right.
A place to be unapologetic about my experience, pain.
Right.
A place where I can learn and cry and be one with my fellow beings. Yes.
Yes. These are all right.
Explore mistakes without causing harm. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Vulnerability without judgment.
Mm-hmm.
Vulnerability and acceptance.
Mm-hmm.
Feeling the power of ancestral connection.
That's right. That's right. That's right. So we've gotten a lot of your sort of like descriptions and your experiences. A place without judgment or pressure is one that I see popping up here, right? So we'll go to the next slide just to give you a sense of what we found when we started looking for and when we look for affinity spaces, right? Like, so really basic. So you've given us this robust, full definition, each and every one of you, right? Just these very connected definitions. But simply, right? You sort of Google it, you find a source, and it's like, okay, affinity spaces, two things: interest-driven places, hubs for collaboration, right? A group of people who are brought together by a common interest, a social group formed by an appreciation or a love of something, or a love of for each other, right? Of that group, inside of that group, where relationships can develop between the active people in that group, right? So for the purpose of this workshop, we are going to really think and focus on, male identified, sort of like particular cis male identified only groups, and white identified, like white affinity space groups. However, I appreciate that the other groups are coming up because I think that there's also something to learn. I've been in affinity spaces with just Black women, right? Black women who understand me, Black women who get me. They show the empathy that you talked about. They make me feel safe. As you said, I can speak freely in those spaces. And so these are examples, but think and consider all of these other spaces. We're troubling the concept and this notion, right? We're not eliminating it. We're troubling it. Even in my own Black women's affinity space, I want to be able to trouble that. And so we'll move to the next slide.
Right. And so I think it's really crucial, Farah, just the distinction that you made, that we're thinking about these two broad buckets, right, of individuals who are together for a common interest or for common safety or common brave space or whatever that looks like. And then also those who want to be and operate in solidarity of those who are in those other spaces or affinity spaces, right? So there might be a Black women's only affinity space, but there might be white allies who want to be in an affinity space to be of support, right? And so those two distinct and I think broad buckets are also crucial. Affinity spaces have been around for a while, and we'll get an opportunity to talk about what the history of affinity spaces have been. But before that, we want to talk about why they work, right? Why are they effective? And you've started naming them even in just your description of what an affinity space is. And so why they work, right? They provide a sense of community. They bring people together in safer environments. So affinity spaces are not predetermined safe spaces, but they can be safer than other environments. They allow for better socializing among those who may not feel comfortable with what they define as other people, right? Or people who fall outside of their interest base or outside of their community base. They promote creativity and also thought process, right? It might be a more generative space. These are why affinity spaces work. They promote vulnerability. That was said a lot. Compassion. They also bring about a level of comfort and honesty, empathy, acceptance. All of that can happen inside of affinity spaces, right? So challenges and inspiration, right? Vulnerability without judgment, right? All of these things, vulnerability without acceptance, all of these things that you've named are why affinity spaces work. And as we're looking at why affinity spaces work, it's also really important to think about, and I think as we frame, for the next phases and next steps of this discussion, if we were to turn affinity spaces on
the actual moment, because this is like 2 hours of footage that I'm going through right now.
Someone needs to mute
themselves.
That one is stunning.
Someone needs to mute, I think. Thank you. So this is why affinity spaces work, right? And so what does this also mean about spaces that are not affinity spaces, right? The world we walk in, or even more integrative spaces, or our movement spaces, right? Movement spaces are not inherent affinity spaces. So I want to go to the next slide and just talk about what this means about non-affinity spaces. If we have all these agreements about what affinity spaces are, what do our non-affinity and maybe even desegregated spaces do or mean, or how are they defined? Mm-hmm. Right? And so all we've done here is that we've put the counter to it. And we've said, that means that our non-affinity spaces and our desegregated spaces do the following for us personally or collectively. They don't provide a sense of community. They don't bring people together in safer environments. They don't allow for better socializing among those of us who find ourselves more diverse from another person, or as we're defined, right? They don't promote this vulnerability and compassion. They don't promote a sense of comfort or safety or security. They don't promote honesty, right? This might be most of the spaces that each of us is operating in, if affinity spaces are the more marginalized space that we're in. And they also don't promote empathy and acceptance, right? So is this the world that we want? Do we want a world where we have to go off into a very special room or special place, or be inside of a very special affinity group in order to feel all of those things? Safety, community, comfort, honesty, generative spaces where our creativity is nurtured and stimulated, where our liberation is attainable, right? Is that the world that we want? One where that is the more marginalized, not necessarily the more, like the more feasible or attainable vision, right? Do we want to keep nurturing affinity spaces in favor of desegregated, inclusive, integrative problem-solving spaces, or even reconciliation spaces or restorative spaces? Or do we want the reverse, right? Do we want the previous slide where there's a sense of community, of safety, of creativity, vulnerability, compassion, honesty, empathy? Do we want that to be the world we live in versus a group or a space that we create?
And can that happen? Can it happen? Savannah, you asked the question, you said, do we want that to be the world that we want to live in, right? And can we still create that world where we feel that way in non-affinity spaces?
Right.
Right? Can we still have a space that provides a sense of community? Can we still have a space that brings people together and the environment feels safe? Can we still have a space, be in space with others, someone different than ourselves, that allows for better socializing, right? That allows for comfort and face-to-face interaction where people don't get canceled, right? Where there's still empathy, where creativity is allowed, where people are allowed to show up as who they are, right? And people are allowed to show up with their culture, where people are allowed to show up with their mistakes, right? With their, misunderstandings, with their imperfections, where people, can wrestle and engage with each other authentically and still be accepted, right? Our spaces where we all look alike, where we all are the same, are those the only spaces where these feelings and these sort of characteristics and these ways of being can manifest? That is the question that we are posing. That is the question that we are posing. So what does this mean? So we'll go to the next slide, right? What does this mean? At what point then, right, do affinity spaces become problematic? If the answer is nope, we have to be in affinity spaces. Affinity spaces are the only way to solve our problems, the only way to do some self-reflection, the only ways to unpack what we need to unpack our privilege, unpack our, how we've destroyed a community, or unpack how we are, unpack our racism, unpack our sexism, unpack our transphobia, right? If those are the only spaces, right? If this is the only way, the only container for such a thing to happen, then at what point do our own affinity spaces? So for example, at what point do my all Black women's space, all Black cisgender women's space become problematic? At what point do all the all white affinity space become a problem? At what point do all the does the all cis male identified space become problematic, right? So we came up with several answers to that. So one, when the affinity space becomes safe space for participants to remain in perpetual reflection on their privilege with no action, right? So we know of some spaces where people are constantly just talking about their privileges and the guilt around their privileges, guilt around their privileges, and no action. So in that sense, if we continue to engage in affinity spaces in this way, then it becomes problematic, right? When the affinity space maintains a sense of superiority among those in the affinity group, who begin to see themselves as so privileged that they pity others, placing themselves on a pedestal with self-grandiosity, not even realizing that that is what is happening. Because in the affinity space, the conversation is so focused on this idea that the participant has so much privilege, and so do the other people standing around them and in the same affinity space, that they're the only ones who can save, or there's something to save, and there's something to sort of even atone for, right? There's this self-punishment, right? Or there's this sort of, oh, I feel so sorry for this other group of people, right? So at the beginning, when we said we're bringing to the table who we are, right? This brings us to this conversation here. What is privilege? We will get into that. How affinity spaces nurture this perpetual reflection sometimes on privilege, depending on the affinity space, right? With no action. And how do some affinity spaces foster this sort of pitying of others and this sort of self-aggrandizement, it's sometimes inadvertently, or self-grandiosity, right? That we walk into this space and we are the ones who pretty much rule the world. We are the ones who pretty much can change, can make the change, create change, undo, redo. So then power sits only with that group, really ignoring what power exists at what some have defined as the margins. So I have a story in the next slide, which speaks specifically to that, right? So Savannah and I, along with several colleagues, we went to South Africa, right? We're constantly going back to South Africa, to different parts of the world, right? Some might call that privilege. There you go. So during our time in South Africa earlier this year, we engaged in a multiracial and multi-gender movement space where we participated in this introductory exercise on privilege. Each of us were given these little pipe cleaners and a set of beads that we would use to acknowledge and recognize our privilege based on the prompts the facilitator gave us. So with each privilege that the facilitator gave us and said, have you had such a level of education? When you walk down the street with your partner, do you get stares and looks, or are you harassed? Or do you know, whatever the prompt was, did you live in a house? Did you go to a school where you had computers? With all of the prompts, with every privilege, we added a bead to the pipe cleaner bracelet around each of our wrists. So after each of us, the people of color, after the debrief, oh my goodness, what did we experience? After each of us, people of color had shared the results based on the number of beads on our personal bracelets, referencing which privilege each bead represented for everyone, right? So this bead was when you said that, I went to a school where, the teachers were, I don't know, they picked on me more. Like when I raised my hand, they said, they called on me. So we started to discuss and reference which privilege each bead represented. At our table, however, there was a white man with the most beads than everyone else on his privileged wristband.
Yeah. At
the end of the exercise. So he shared in the debrief, we were like, wow, okay. So as we all sat down, the one with they did the count, and the one left standing was this man with all these beads. So he shared in the debrief that he says, at times, I walk with so much shame and so much guilt because of the amount of privilege I have, as you can see in the beads. True story. As you can see in the beads. And he said this to us after we shared in honor, of our great ancestors. So one of the things that we shared was, our connection, to our great ancestors, just like I did when I talked about who I am, and Savannah did when she talked about who she is. What do we bring to this space, who we are? And he said, I feel so bad for you. He's looking at us. I feel so bad for you. And he says, I wish I could share with you the privilege that I have, because, in his words, he said he never has to think about his ancestors. And he wished, that we had so much privilege as he does, because he can move through the world without thinking about his ancestors. And so I was like, wow. I looked at him and I said, wow, in truth, sir, I feel sorry for you. In truth, sir, I wish you could walk around with this privilege of being in constant communication, of being in constant communion with your ancestors. You're looking at me as if you have a privilege, as if you are in a position that puts you in a place of power and dominance and comfort, because you never have to think about your ancestors. Even in the enslavement of my ancestors, there is power in that. There is power in the sense that my ancestors made sure that I survived. The fact that I am sitting here with you right now says to me that there are things that we are capable of doing. There are things that we're capable of conjuring. There are things that we're capable of seeing into the future that even made it possible for me to be here. There are legacies that I have inherited that make me connected to the earth, that make me connected to the sky, to the trees, to the animals, that give me a different sense of relationship to the world. And that survived. To me, is a definition. It's a definition of privilege. I find myself incredibly lucky to be able to connect with my ancestors in that way. And so he was just stunned. He was stunned because he then, of course, during that time and during that space, I don't know, Savannah, if you have anything to add to that story, because you were there as well. But in that time and in that space, as we discussed that with him, it sort of reversed for him his whole definition of privilege.
Yeah. And I think in that moment, it also kind of, we, in a lot of spaces, right, we engage and we exercise, right, around checking our privilege, having understanding and awareness around our privilege, leaving our privilege at the door, right, all of these things, or coming in full force, acknowledging our privilege, whatever that looks like. But in this moment, and I think we'll get to this in a couple of slides, there was a paradigm shift around what privilege even was and what privilege even means, right? And so when Farah talks about challenging affinity spaces, where there's this deep reflection around how one has so much privilege, there's also this lack of acknowledgement and this erasure around the cultures, communities, villages of people who also walk with privilege that goes unacknowledged by white privilege. To allow white privilege to be the standard and the norm is a reinforcement and a reification of the violences that we're actively trying to fight against. So we end up in these cyclical spaces where we're pushing back and fighting back and biting back against privilege, but we're not naming where our own privileges come from, and we're allowing them to not go acknowledged, right? And so that paradigm shift was so crucial and so critical, especially in a place as complex as South Africa, right? For two Black women of different walks, even different diasporic walks and different diasporic privileges, to name their ancestors as a spiritual, cultural currency, right? As a part of what allows us to move through a world with power and to survive this world with power, was such a critical shift and a critical moment. So just really amazing moment that I think really reinforces, what we want to shed light on today and how we want to shift even our own internal notions within the movement of how we deal with privilege and how we allow affinity spaces to deal with privilege as well.
Right, right. So then with the next slide, right, there's this unpacking of internalized superiority then that took place, right, in that space, right? We troubled that space, right? Then it was like, well, why do you feel you're superior to me? Do you feel so sorry for me that I'm in touch with my ancestors at all times? It's because you define what privilege is every day. You took it upon yourself to define what privilege is. And what's really troubling is that many of us accept that definition based on specifically what this white man said privilege was. And so then what we do is we sort of reduce ourselves, we minimize ourselves, we sort of, and we shrink away, and we don't realize what we come to the table with and who we are, right? So when we talk, we started an unpacking of internalized superiority, right? It internalized racial, gender, class, and other superiority in that space, right? The acceptance, which is the acceptance of an acting out of a superior definition. It's really rooted in the historical designation of one's race, gender, or other identity over many generations. This process of empowerment and access expresses itself as unearned privileges, right? Access to institutional power and invisible advantages based upon race or any other identity. And when we say unearned privileges, how did this particular man earn? What was earned? Like there's this whole notion, this whole question around unearned, right? So society tells him, his society, where he comes from, tells him that it's a privilege not to be able to think about your ancestors, right? And that's so tied to how he moves in the world, right? That's so tied to how he continues to perpetuate a society where white supremacist, capitalist, misogynist ways of being are what are valued, whereas, liberatory, anti-oppression, generous, mutual aid spaces are what are devalued. So with the next slide, I don't know, Savannah, if you have anything to add to that.
No, I think that's good. And it really just segues into this next slide where we actually outline, what the difference between common notions and definitions of privilege are. And the counter definition that we want to present that I think will really lead us into a new conversation, right? Lead us into a new conversation around how we handle and deal with power and privilege and what that story reveals to us about that. So Farah, if you want to just take us through these definitions.
Sure. So really, when you look at the common definition versus the counter definition of privilege, which we are sort of, we're like, okay, what can we do with this group? And I'm longing to be with each one of you, because then I would have newsprint and we would write it down and we would come up with a counter definition of privilege. Or do we call it privilege at all, right? Do we shift privilege on its head, right? As some of you are already saying in the chat room. The common definition of privilege, as you see here, is, as it's defined in our anti-racist circles, it's a right or immunity granted systematically or to personal benefit, advantage, to personally benefit, advantage, or favor someone else, a particular group. Privilege grants a set of benefits and system rewards to one group while simultaneously excluding other groups from accessing these advantages, right? So keep in mind this whole issue of access and advantage, right? So you can gatekeep. Yes. This provides an opportunity for people to gatekeep when privilege is defined that way. Someone can gatekeep and says, I'm not giving you access because I'm saying that these blue marbles make me privileged. So if you can't get a blue marble, I have blue marbles, so you can't have them, or these red marbles, or whatever it is that you want to use as an example or a metaphor. We are offering a counter definition, and this is not set in stone, right? So this is a place to do bold moves. So what is your bold move, right? Let's talk about, if we can, even over the chat, let's begin to unpack and shift the paradigm around privilege. To me, when I think of what a privilege is, I think of a blessing. I think of just, definitely not something that, I'll read it, right? So the counter definition for me is of privilege goes beyond material goods. That's one, right? It goes beyond this whole market economy. It goes beyond sort of like the bequeath of like financial wealth. It goes beyond possessions. It goes beyond value that is granted, right? No one can say and decide that you are valuable if you are inherently valuable by virtue of the fact that you are here, right? It goes beyond what the system can reward and offer, especially if we're talking about dismantling a system, right? So for me, gaining access does not mean that I become part of the system, does not mean that I want the system to give me access. It means that I find within me what I already have, what I already possess. It means that we find within us what we already have, what we already possess, regardless of whether the system or another group gives that to us, right? If we do that, then we will truly be sharing in mutuality. We will truly be involved in mutual, just this communion with each other to ensure that we are all valued and everything we bring is valued. We see privilege as those sets of attributes, all attributes, right? Knowledge, our wisdom, that is the domain of all human beings. Not just all human beings, all beings, right? It is the capacity to recognize and access, right? Not someone giving you access, but things that we already have access to. We may not even know it, that it's already there. It's already there. You have to recognize that you can access these non-material wealth as a different kind of inheritance, right? Mm-hmm. So we have inheritance, we have legacies, we have things that we have been born into. There are possibilities, there are ways of being, there are ways of even surviving that many others could not do, because to them, privilege is not being able to think of your ancestors. Privilege is having more money. Privilege is, a certain identity that they've decided is better than your identity, whether that is gender identity, whether that is race, racial identity, whether that is ethnicity, whether that is geography, right? Who gets to say what is privilege and what is not, right? Who gets to say what is privilege and what is not is who gets to maintain it that way, so that we can never rise. All we do is talk about bold moves, but we can never make those bold moves because we have internalized so much that the other is superior because of some type of privilege that they've assigned to themselves by neglecting ours or ignoring ours or minimizing ours so that we don't even realize the power we already have. Right?
And I would even add, like, culturally, if we're saying here that it goes beyond material goods and it also demonstrates itself as non-material wealth. But then there is land, right? There is food, there is wisdom, there's knowledge and wisdom that translates, right, into being able to grow one's own food, right? And eat one's own food, which we've grown, right? Our grandmother's green thumbs, right? That all is a part of understanding privilege through a paradigm shift that actually does have material stakes and that actually does have material consequences, right? Depending on how we relate to it. And so even that inheritance and the understanding around that inheritance, we must expand, and think more deeply, right, around how this counter definition is not just a theoretical framework, but it's actually the way that we survive. It's the way that we go for more than survive, that we thrive, right? It's the way that we build whole communities and whole nations, and the interventions and the ways that we keep ourselves safe, right, are actually because of these privileges. We actually get to reverse that and be in a knowing and an understanding that we have everything that we need in order to create safe, healthy, strong, vibrant, thriving communities with this understanding of where privilege lies, right? And so it's not just about us understanding it. It's also about our allies and our accomplices also understanding that and those levels of privilege.
And the next slide, please.
Yeah, so the story itself just really, really revealed a lot to us. And some of the things that it revealed, underscored, undergirded for us was that our regard, our narratives, our stories, even just the definitions that we have about privilege and power as a pairing require a paradigm shift, right? Not just for us to understand, for us to shift within our movement and a shift within our solidarity efforts as well. Mm-hmm. The story also underscores for us walking into a room, and again, this is about ancestral power, right? And ancestral privilege, not just as one person, but as many, right? Even thousands, right? With the spirits of our ancestors, freedom fighters, justice seekers, culture keepers, armies of spiritualists is privilege, is power. And even being in acknowledgement and recognition of our ancestors is a level of self-understanding and self-awareness that we'd actually call all of our white allies and accomplices to be inside of with us. If you want to claim privilege, be in a self-awareness and a self-understanding about who your ancestors are, what they've done, what legacies and chains you want to break and reconfigure for a full liberatory space for us all, not just for you to be in what Farah named earlier, eternal contemplation and reflection around what you believe your privilege to be, but to really be an understanding that we enter a room as many, even thousands, right? In recognition of our ancestors, for us is the ultimate. And then for you to engage in that with us and to be an acknowledgement also of your ancestors is also towards reconciliation, which we're going to talk more about.
Exactly.
So this privilege and power, we wanted to name too, which would be a whole other workshop, but that paradigm shift is incredibly critical.
Right. We'll move to the next slide. We have a lot to cover. Let's go to the next slide. I would move it myself, but I don't know how.
I think it starts with
a
few.
Yes, we can do that. Yes, because we covered that, right? Mm-hmm. So why nothing for us without us, right? So as Savannah talked about, right? Why nothing for us without us? Nothing for us without us, because you cannot be in a space, as I talked about, I think in the plenary, how can you be in a space with folks that look like you on my behalf? Ultimately, it is on my behalf. Sure, it is to unpack your own sort of privilege and, your own sort of issues, the harm that you have caused. But where then does it go? To what end?
Yeah.
If the end is to build better relationships with me or those who look like me, if the end is to build better relationships or to change the world for the better so that trans people or thrive, so that girls thrive, so that Black people thrive, then how can you be in a space on your own? How can I be in an affinity space that doesn't include the other people that I am discussing, for whom I am supposedly doing this work? How do I know what the other group wants or what the other group feels? Is it just through their speeches? Is it just by researching? Is it just through social media? It has to go beyond that. Creating brave space is not just me and Savannah sitting in a room talking about our xenophobia or talking about our transphobia or talking about our internalized racism, whatever it is. It's not just sitting in a room talking about, our particular privileges or the particular harms we have caused to the others who are still outside, right? The transformation happens when we open the door and we say, come and let us sit together. Let us have that conversation together. How would you like me to show up? Right? And we're not encouraging the movement to burden women, for example, or survivors in the fight to end violence, right? We're not really asking also for, Black folks to, teach white folks. That's not what we're asking for, right? We're asking for this common ground. We're asking for this place. Where is that space? If for those of you who heard the plenary yesterday, where is that space where we can be in synchronicity? Where is that space that each of us in our transition, each of us in our own right, can sit together and begin to resonate with each other, right?
And where is the space that we can be in authentic relationship, right? Authentically relate, where we can be in beloved community, right? Mm-hmm. Where is the space where we can actually mature the movement, right? Transform our spaces to not just having to be, well, we have integrated spaces, then we have affinity spaces. How do we actually move us beyond creating our organizing binaries that we've created that haven't proven effective, right? They might have been proven safe to the degree, not in terms of safety and security, but to the degree that we're in the same spot. It's too safe, right? It's become a place where we're not challenged enough, or we're not moving forward our ideologies, and we're not stretching enough.
And a good example of that is the history lesson, right? Of where affinity spaces, one very deep history lesson around affinity spaces by and really spoken of by Didi Delgado. And Savannah, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, absolutely. So we're really grateful to Didi for really outlining, right, where well-intended affinity spaces have also gone wrong, right, historically, and also begin to coalesce around an agenda that actually perpetuates the very harms that they're looking to debunk or dismantle. So white-led affinity, specifically anti-racism groups, have existed for hundreds of years. This is not something new that we've come up with in our lifetime, but they've also often proven problematic and counterproductive as a space. So an example, the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society of 1833, which believed that slave owners were missing out on a business opportunity by not putting slaves on payroll. This is an anti-racism space.
Totally good intention, right?
Well-intentioned groups really
pay the people who work for you. Pretty much that's what they're saying. They thought that that's how they could help. So they sat in the affinity space and said, how could we right our wrongs? How could we do better? Oh, what if we just pay them, right? Not thinking further, not really asking the people who are on the plantations, the people who are enslaved, whether or not you even want to be there, payment or not.
And Didi really presents this, right? This story, which is utterly ridiculous, right? Let's just name it. And they argued, right, that paying slaves would make them doubly valuable to their masters because paid laborers were more motivated than forced labor. And I mean, this is the absurdity, right, around it. And we're using this as an example because this does happen in real time in our movements when we have ally spaces that are well, this is what we should do. And then what ends up happening is there's this insertion where it's something has gone terribly wrong, Terribly wrong, right? So Nothing for Us Without Us is also about not making these massive hyperbolic mistakes, right, without us in the room. The anti-slavery society was equally concerned, of course, with growing the free labor market in order to sustain capitalism, right? So it's like, what are you even fighting for? If you're not fighting for our liberation, then why aren't we in the room, right? As ending the gruesome practices of slavery. And those were among the most radical white folks of the day, right? Even Frederick Douglass would be in spaces with them. So then there was also tokenizing that was happening, right? There are other, again, power and privilege dynamics. And while Frederick Douglass was no doubt working with what he had at his disposal, again, the dynamics, we have to acknowledge that sometimes what we have at our disposal leaves much to be desired. The point here is that by creating these bubbles, even within white supremacy, it's like recreating a bubble within a bubble where it's safe, again, to practice anti-racism. We're implying there are places where racism can remain unchallenged. In many ways, white anti-racism spaces serve as safety nets, protecting allies, and also leaving us stuck, right? Leaving us stuck in the cycles that we're already inside of, protecting allies from their own uncertainty, from their own fear of failure, and also simultaneously not just keeping people of color or marginalized, and again, in quotations, individuals at a distance, right, from their own liberation, but completely excluding them and re-perpetuating harms. The very harms that these groups are supposedly getting together to fix, right, or to resolve or to evolve. And so when we think about really why that history lesson resonates, right, why that's so important, we can also think about like where the history of nothing for us without us even comes from, right? And so that model comes from disability justice, disability rights activists, particularly James Charlton, who traces the origins back to South Africa in the 1980s. It was really used and steeped in political advocacy, right? So in the same way that we have groups of white men, particularly politicians, making decisions about women of color's bodies or trans people's healthcare, right, in the White House right now, in the Senate. This activist was saying, don't make decisions about policies that are generational without us in the room. Don't make decisions about our access without asking us first, right? So nothing for us without us is really a rallying cry that we want to see be more a part of our work, even when we think about men ending violence, right? Male violence, abolition of male violence and patriarchal.
That's our next slide, yes.
And so when we think about what it means for us to be in the room when decisions are made about us, right? We can think specifically on a parallel conversation about what that means for men who seek to end violence or male-identified folks who seek to end violence against women in particular, and even our white allies and accomplices who seek to lift up racial justice without us in the room, right? So when we talk about troubling affinity spaces, this is what we're talking about. We're talking about how it's become more and more core that men are in the room as folks who perpetuate harm disproportionately against women, being in the room as an ally, but not having us in the room, right? So we're talking about what multi-gender or multi-spatial containers do we actually have? Do we have any that exist right now that have succeeded in violence prevention? How do we critique the spaces that are in place right now, right? The spaces where men are just in the room together. And how do we disrupt really what could be another kind of locker room talk, where behind closed doors, our allies or our male counterparts are talking about what it means to end violence against women, femmes, trans, non-binary people, and not having us in the room, right? To speak up about what it is that we want to see, what we believe the solutions around that are, how we want to experience, right? As you said, Farah, how we want to experience our counterparts and our allies in the work to end violence, what we even want that to look like. So that patriarchy, misogyny, and sexism are not just reinvented in this prevention strategy, but instead they're fully challenged.
Next slide.
So challenging this idea, again, I think that there's levels also, there's a fear-based prevention that's happening, that we think only men can teach men how to end violence, or only white people can teach white people how to end racism, right? It's gotten to a place now where we're trying to workshop ourselves out of these oppressions. We're trying to workshop ourselves out of these isms to a degree that has us in cycles, even within the movement. So we're trying to break cycles within our communities, intercommunal violence, intercultural violence, but we're using the same strategies that got us to where we are. So how do we challenge these ideas? And what are the structures that we need in place that will actually move us to integration, that will move us to transformative spaces, that will move us to authentic spaces, that will move us to be okay to be in principled struggle with one another, right? As we talked about at the beginning of the session today. What do we need? What do we have to give up? What does it require of us? What does our liberation demand? That we let go of not affinity spaces, we trouble affinity spaces, but we let go of the idea that our transformation will look a certain way, right? So when we talk about also engaging men, and Farah, jump in here whenever you think.
The next slide, please. Mm-hmm.
At times, of course, we can point to all the problematic things about what our engaging men work has looked like. And one, it has leapfrogged, as Jeanne Ward says, over women's rights organizations, right? And I don't necessarily agree that it's undermined the leadership of these organizations or women's rights or women-led organizations, but it certainly has left us out of the conversation and has created even stifling environments, I think. Whereas well-intentioned prevention strategies might be presented, but they don't get us anywhere. Let's just be honest, they're not getting us anywhere. And in fact, we've had more instances, intra-communal, intra-movement instances of violence happen at conferences, at national convenings, at programs, where now that we have these integrative spaces, we've actually had more cases and more issues within the violence prevention movement. So what's the framework that we need? What is actually the blueprint that we need to actually be in the room together and listen to one another and not be stepping on each other's toes as we talk about what our liberation requires and what's needed for us to move beyond violence intervention and towards prevention altogether.
Right, right.
And so we wanted to give a successful example, right? What that has looked like. And Farah, you can talk about what Machilo Motse's work looks like in South Africa and what was needed at the center of it, which was around healing work and reconciliation.
Right, right. So Machilo Motse, part of the work that we also did in South Africa and really meeting with folks in South Africa, I believe is possible everywhere. And many of the plenary speakers spoke about it. A lot of the workshop talked about it. When we talk about abolition and we talk about really transformation and restorative justice. So part of the work Machilo did is she also went into the prisons, much in the same way that a lot of our plenary speakers, at least one or two of them, and workshop facilitators talked about going into prisons and talking to harm doers as a woman, a female identified person. She walks into the prisons and works directly with the men who have caused harm, right? Some of them who had already been in affinity groups with other men, right? Some of them who had already been in groups where they're talking about how they unpack their sexism and their misogyny and their male privilege and the patriarchy. And the work is highly successful. It is highly successful. The conversation with her about 5 or 6 months ago was tremendous to be able to sit there. And at the center of that work was this whole notion of healing. And we are on the cusp of that. We're actually sitting in that right now, as I heard in a lot of the workshops. So how do we do the work of healing? That leads to reconciliation, beginning with truth telling with each other, right? Beginning with truth telling, beginning with, this notion of justice, right? As Aisha Shahida Simmons talks about, love with accountability, right? Love with accountability, showing up with that love, but also with accountability. What will it mean to be accountable so that justice can be done in a way that we define it as a community, in a way that we define it as survivors even, right? And then what does it mean to go from that space of justice as we define it to then healing together? Justice has to be done. Accountability has to be done before we can then move into healing and then really be able to move into a process of reconciliation, which doesn't happen overnight, but it is possible, as we've seen in many of these examples. So, in the next slide, really it's about self-evaluation. It's about community evaluation. And we have heard over and over again that, some of these, the practice of men engaging men has failed us. This is not to beat up on excuse the words. This is not to say that men should not engage men, but the ways in which that they are only engaging each other, right? It has not worked for us. We are still experiencing violence. The ways in which white affinity groups and the people in white affinity groups are engaging each other has not worked for us. And I'm sure that there are groups that can say the same about the ways in which Black women are engaging each other is not working for those who see us as privileged, for those who see us as having caused harm to them. And so I wanted to make sure to say that as well. So what is this current moment? Next slide. That we are talking about. What is the current moment, right? We're talking about the recent uprisings. What do we do, right? In the small time that we have, we're going to talk about strategies. We're going to talk about bold moves. We're going to talk about what are the radical services, what are the radical policy practices that we should be talking about in this moment, that we should be not just talking about, but engaging in, and not engaging in silos, right? With the recent uprisings against white supremacy and the inequities exposed by the COVID pandemic, I think we've all come to the realization, I hope that we've all come to the realization that bold moves, that radical moves are needed in every aspect of our way of being. How do we re-energize ourselves? How do we interrupt cycles of deprivation, not only for each other, but only for ourselves? We talked a lot about self-care as well over these past 2 days, as you saw in the workshops and in the plenaries. So how do we interrupt, these cycles? How do we create these bold, radical policy changes if needed, policy and practice models to interrupt these cycles, right? How do we make bold and radical a bold and radical movement towards reconciliation spaces, like with the Reconciliation Center that Black Women's Blueprint is creating as we speak, right? What are the radical ways of being? We're going to move quickly.
Yeah. And I think with the next slide, I don't know if we have time for the story, but the next, you can go to the next slide around like the current movement and what the invitation is, right? Which is to embody beloved community, right? It's about how we resist, as Farah said, silos, resist isolationist tendencies, reject divide and conquer tactics. We had a situation earlier this year where there were still colorism issues, right? And there was still an understanding and a notion around privilege and power between light-skinned and dark-skinned women, right? Within the movement and within the community. That needs a paradigm shift, right? Those are divide and conquer tactics, right? How do we build bold, radical services? How do we build a radical movement that, of course, calls in reconciliation and radical ways of being, right? I love that you said that, Farah, because once we start embracing those shared and common values and we start embracing radical strategies, then we'll be able to champion systems change and systems transformation, right? That we really want to see. But really at the level of the individual and the collective, we need to be in transformation as well. And so we also wanted to share that guiding question once again, right? How can we build an interconnected and vibrant community that provides the conditions, one, for survivors, yes, but then also for those who cause harm to be in a process of healing, to be in a process of thriving, and also practicing interconnection. So that means with our white allies and our white community members and accomplices to be in right relationship with us as we're doing transformational work. And the same thing for men, engaging those of us across the gender spectrum to build and grow with us. And that requires a radical and necessary unlearning, right? There's a need for us to open up, to expand, to be in
next slide.
wonderment. Yes, in the next slide. Learn something and then also receive feedback around it, right? On that number 2, centering ourselves and reconnecting to core values, but then also reconnecting to who we are and who our ancestry is. I think that's really, really important for us. Discerning also, right? Figuring out what you personally are going to do now. What is your next move as an individual and also collectively within your community? And then responding with action, with gratitude, with supporting and helping others. There's this important notion too that the movement needs us, right? And we absolutely cannot give up because it is hard or because it's very complex. I think that sometimes we just throw the towel in, or some of us throw the towel in because it's just gotten too heavy. Not our work, but in this engagement of working across identities becomes too complex, right? And so what does it mean to not attack those who face oppression or whose feelings or expressions show up in our movement spaces, or when we feel bad or our privilege shows up or there's guilt, right? How do we shift that paradigm to be spiritually, transformatively, personally, socially more mature, right? Where is that maturation inside of our movement spaces that allows us to be grounded and actually move forward, not in desperation, but knowing that there's no other option, and that's what liberation requires of us.
And so as we go to the next slide, right, I want to invite us, because then it goes into a whole other section where we talk about what we're doing, but we only have about 5 minutes left, right? And so what I want to do is adhere with all of these questions, really just, and I know that I've been seeing sort of like the comments and in the chat, you know, I think that we can ask these questions to ourselves, right? And really answer them in the next 5 minutes, really try to engage with each other, even if just via the chat, right? How do you, you know, based on who you are and what space you occupy, based on the privileges that this society, that this culture, this white supremacist, misogynist, a patriarchal, a capitalist culture said, based on the privileges that this society says that you have, how do you engage with other people who are different than you, who see you as privileged? What practices could you add? How do you engage in racial healing and gender justice work across genders, right? What roles can you use to dismantle oppressive systems in your family, in your work, in your community? And depending on your identities, what are the costs or barriers? Lastly, what movements are you part of or do you support? If you feel disconnected, how can you plug in? If you want to deepen your participation, what's the next step for you? Mm-hmm. Right? So, you know, I was thinking that we would stop there. And yes, thank you for showing us the next slide. A reconciliation center is needed. So what would that look like? What would it mean to be in reconciliation, to be in that process of truth telling, of defining justice and doing justice, mm-hmm. of doing right by each other, of accountability, love, right? What would that look like for you? Any ideas, any sort of things that inspire you, right? That you might want to share in the chat. How do we engage each other? How do you engage with people who are different than you? And what practices could you add?
I just dropped it in the chat for those who are looking to see more closely the questions that we're asking now as we close.
Any of these questions can be answered. Mm-hmm. Standing in your truth. Mm-hmm. Standing in your truth, yes. Yes.
Do the work to build trust in relationships and love, yes.
Serving communities together, yes. So many options now with so many communities hurting. Get out there to serve, listen and learn together. Mm-hmm. Is there a both and here? Yes, absolutely. Listening first, Educate yourself.
If you don't understand, ask. Experience perspectives. Yeah.
Racial healing. Yes. Racial healing. Honesty. Imposter syndrome is one thing that we constantly feel. Guilt is something that we constantly feel. How do we reframe affinity spaces and privilege? How do we value all aspects holistically, all aspects of everyone? How do we start to define and talk about and honor in each other the things that perhaps mainstream society doesn't realize are incredibly, incredibly important? If you do not understand, ask. Active listening, always listening, always listening. Checking yourself for your biases. Strengths perspective, yes, curiosity. Active listening again. Listen to those who are courageous enough to model. Having one-on-one open conversations, absolutely 100%. Trust the process. Meet people where they are. Being okay with having been wrong about something. And not canceling someone out if they are wrong about something. Being patient with each other.
Lead the process. Yes.
Leading the process is good. Yes. Listening about inequality, recognizing biases and racism in interactions and policies, not only with people in your neighborhood, but with survivors we work with our colleagues, with the people we hire in our organization, and with the people who lead our organization. It goes in both directions. If you have, a horizontal sort of leadership, it goes in both directions as well. Give grace.
Yeah, grace is a big one. It's very important.
Yes, paying communities for their labor, connecting with communities with the work, but also creating genuine friendship, authentic relating. Yes. Thank you for all you have said. Thank you for being willing to listen to us, making eye contact and breathing.
Yes.
The genuine friendship is indeed hard. Yeah. Certificates of attendance, yes. We'll talk to Calcasa about that. Knowing your own story is incredibly important. And not debasing it or minimizing it in favor of another story. Especially the dominant story. Let's not minimize ourselves for the dominant story. So yes, thank you so much. We are at 3:32.
This was incredibly powerful. Thank you all for bringing your full selves and your hearts and minds, and also strategy, right? Strategizing with us about how we go forward.
Yes.
And I see some more things still popping into the chat. So keep it coming. We're so grateful.
Yes.
We can't wait to see you at the Reconciliation Center and be engaged in this work in a deeper way with each of you. Connect with us. Please keep connecting with us and stay in touch with us.
Yes. Continue to shift the paradigm. Continue not to accept the common definitions that you are given.
Yes. Challenge it, question it all. Right? Thank you all. Thank you so much. So much gratitude.
Thank you. You inspire us. Thank you.
Ashe.
So much love. Thank you. Much love to everyone. Thank you, Calcasa. Thank you, NSAC, for creating this space.
Thank you, Calcasa.